All right, welcome to episode 1 of Outer Banks History Dude. This one is called No Navy, No Problem. During the American Civil War, the Confederates, the South, had no navy whatsoever, so they had to make one from scratch. The North, knowing that the Confederates had no navy, sent all the ships they had to blockade the southern ports and coastline to choke off the economy and all trade. This video will deal with some of the inventions and infernal machines that the Confederates came up with to help fight the blockade and fight the Union Navy. Some of the shipwrecks from the Civil War are still visible on the Outer Banks today, and at the end of this video we'll go through where they are and how they wrecked and a little bit about the history of those ships. At any rate, enjoy. This is an actual photo of New Ironsides. It's a Yankee ironclad and one of the most powerful ships in the Navy. At 4.5 inches of plated steel, and behind that is 2 feet of oak. You could shoot it directly with a cannon and it would just bounce right off the side. It's armed with 14 11-inch Dahlgren cannons that fire 138-pound projectiles, and has 2 Parrott rifles which fire 150-pound projectiles. That's like shooting an anvil every time it fires. And then it had 2 smaller guns. And it's bombing Charleston, South Carolina, sitting offshore, out of range of any guns, indiscriminately bombing for 24 hours a day. They bombed houses, they bombed churches, bombed schools. They didn't care. Along with the rest of the Yankee fleet that was off Charleston, this bombardment never ended, 24 hours a day, and went on for months. And this particular ship was the most hated of all by the people of Charleston, and they had a reward for anybody that could come up with a way to sink this ship or damage it so bad that it had to leave. This is an image of what a Parrott rifled cannon looked like that was firing 150-pound projectiles at Charleston all day long. Give you an idea of the size of these things. Every now and then, the Yankee fleet that was sitting off of Charleston, bombing indiscriminately out of range, would come into the harbor to try to sack the city itself and get in range of Confederate guns. And every time they did that, it didn't work out well for the North. But New Ironsides, the first time that it went into Charleston harbor, was shot 51 times by cannons, and during the erratic movements of the battle, slammed into 2 other Yankee ships and damaged them. But New Ironsides itself was not damaged. At one point, it sat right over top of a torpedo that had 3,000 pounds of gunpowder in it, and it failed to detonate. Had that detonated, it would have sunk New Ironsides, but it didn't. And despite the collision and the cannon fire, New Ironsides was not significantly damaged. Her iron being 4.5 inches thick, nothing was getting through that. Some of the dories, which are the lifeboats that you see, were shot away, and some of the rigging and minor damage, but nothing threatening the stability of this ship. It was still afloat. It went right back offshore and just continued to bomb Charleston like it had been for months. One of the things that the people of Charleston came up with to fight the blockade was this thing called a David, and the reference was to the Bible with David and Goliath, because they felt like the Union fleet was Goliath and they were David. So they made these little boats, and they had a torpedo on the end of it. It was basically just a beer keg that was full of gunpowder, and it had these little copper knobs on the side that, when bumped into, had a mechanism to light the gunpowder and make it explode. Now, they did not have a flag, as is shown in this picture here. They wanted these to be almost invisible and to go out at night, and the only thing sticking out of the water was a smokestack, and they used fuel that was nearly invisible. They weren't burning coal and having a big black trail. So they found a way to make them almost silent and almost invisible at night, and they were going to use these to go out and blow up New Ironsides. So one night they sent David out after New Ironsides to give it a try, and despite all the efforts to be as stealthy as possible and going at night, The Yankees kept watch at night, and they did see it coming, but they didn't see the David until it was so close that they couldn't bring their cannons to bear 'cause they couldn't aim down with the cannons. So they started firing with muskets and rifles and small arms, which was doing nothing to the David. And the David was able to get up close and detonate the device, and it did explode, and it did damage New Ironsides, but it did not sink it. A huge column of water went up into the air and actually lifted New Ironsides out of the water. When it came crashing back down, the wake and the waves that it made splashed into the David's smokestack and put the fire out so they couldn't move. And the guys on the David had to flee, and they were unbelievably they were able to swim back to shore or get to a rowboat and escape. They had these life vests that they had made out of cork, and they were able to detonate the bomb, and they were able to get away somehow. And only one Yankee was killed, but there was a hole ripped in the iron and through the oak, and it started to take on water, but it was pretty minor. So they did have to leave for about a year. The New Ironsides left Charleston and went to Philadelphia, and when they were doing repairs, they noticed it was a whole lot worse than they thought it had been, but they were still able to patch the ship up and send it back out months later, or almost a year. And the people in Charleston, though, were happy to look out to sea the next day and not see her for the summer of '64. After the event with New Ironsides, the South would invest in making more Davids in Charleston, and on the elsewhere in the rivers, they had a more effective way of dealing with ships that you couldn't really use in the ocean because they'd get swept away by waves or just the ship wouldn't hit it. They used torpedoes, and they're great in the rivers and in the harbors and places that you know a ship is going to go through a narrow channel or whatever. But out in the ocean and fighting against the blockade off Charleston, the torpedoes weren't very useful. You had to attach them to a David and go out there and ram it into the ship. And however, on the rivers, torpedoes were king. This is the USS Cairo, which was sunk in the Yazoo River by a torpedo called a Rains torpedo. These Rains torpedoes, which are old beer kegs full of gunpowder, and they experimented with 100 different ways to make these things. There's many different types of torpedoes that the Confederates used, even electrically charged ones from shore and all this mess. But this one, this model is what sank the most Yankee ships in the war, and it sank the Cairo. This is a drawing that was done in 1862 of what was left of the Cairo, just a little bit sticking out of the river. The torpedoes would sit underneath the water a few feet so that one, the ships couldn't see them, and two, where they would make a hole in the ship would be deep enough to allow a lot of water in to sink the ship. And these torpedoes floated, so the Confederates had chains around them, and they were chained to an anchor of usually lead or something, and that would just keep it right there below the water line where they wanted to hit the ships. So in 1966, with modern technology and cranes and things they had not been able to use in the 1800s to get the Cairo out of the water, people lifted the Cairo out of the Yazoo River. There was a lot of interest in the 1960s in the Civil War because of the 100-year anniversary. And the Cairo today is sitting in Vicksburg, Mississippi, which is right next to the Yazoo River. The Mississippi River and the Yazoo River connect. And right at that elbow where the Yazoo and Mississippi come together is the city of Vicksburg. And that is where you can see the Cairo today on display. This is the first submarine the Confederates built. It's called the Pioneer. It was down in New Orleans, and they had to abandon it when New Orleans was getting attacked. And they built another one, the Pioneer 2, that they used in Mobile, Alabama, and never really got to take it out and had a long story. They had to scuttle that one. They finally went to Charleston and built the Hunley, the same guys, McClintock and Hunley himself and Dixon, they're all um, been involved in all of them, and they did end up sinking one ship with this submarine, but this submarine sank three of its crews. Um, the first one, some of them lived, some of them did not. I had a relative on that sinking. Charles Hasker was the lieutenant, and the second time it went down, I think they all died, and they had to, bring the sub back up and clean out where the dead bodies had been. And third crew, imagine getting in that after it's killed basically two crews already. They went out and sank the Housatonic. It had a hand crank propeller, and they trained day and night for months, and they knew how to do everything in the dark. And they were very highly trained, but still, hand crank propeller. And the one they got was a pretty big. On a scale of 10, it was probably like a 9 or a 10 for wooden ships, but for overall, still a wooden ship, not an iron one. But this one attack killed 5 people, and it just showed it was possible. The Confederates didn't have any real dream of mass producing these submarines because they had a lot more success with the torpedoes and the Davids. But it is a kind of a little ahead of its time to go out there with a hand crank propeller submarine and actually sink a ship. It's the first time that was ever done. Um, and they kind of like an underwater David, really, the way they did it with a spark torpedo as well, and hit the side of the Housatonic. And the guys, some of them were climbing the rigging that night because the water was freezing. It was February. There's a man on board Dixon that had been at the Battle of Shiloh, and his girlfriend gave him a gold coin, a good luck coin, and he got shot in the leg at Shiloh, and the coin blocked the bullet. And so on the back of it, he had my life preserver etched into it with his initials, George Dixon, and the date that Shiloh happened. So it's got the deformity from where it got hit by the bullet too. But he had it with him when he sank on the Hunley and died. So I don't know how lucky it was. It worked first time, saved a bullet, and it's just neat that they were able to find that because it really confirmed, yes, this is a Hunley. Not that there were any other submarines at that time built in that area. This is a photo of the Oriental, which is an ironclad that sank off of Pea Island, which is the northern end of Hatteras Island. It's still there today. It went down in 1862, so early in the war. There's 11 other Union ships that sank off the Outer Banks, all during the Burnside expedition, and then a few more sank after that. The Outer Banks is and always has been a very deadly place for ships of all types. That's why it's called the graveyard of the Atlantic. But you can swim out to this one and snorkel on it if you like. The rest of the ship is underwater, or some of it's under the sand, but it's full of fish, including sharks. And it's just kind of neat that something from that long ago, from the Civil War, is sitting right here and is so easily accessible. This is a shot of the Oriental from a Yankee newspaper at the time as it was going down. So yes, it did have a smokestack and an engine, but it also had sails. That way they could save on coal when they had a long journey. And if anything went wrong with the engine, they had a backup and could use sails. And all of that stuff is under the water. The most famous Civil War shipwreck on the Outer Banks, or probably the most famous Civil War shipwreck period, is that of the Monitor, the famed Monitor that fought against the Virginia or Merrimac at the Battle of Hampton Roads, was also on its way to South Carolina when it sank off of Cape Hatteras in a storm, and 16 or 19 people drowned. It is in too deep of water to go snorkel like the Oriental, but you can scuba dive on it. And there's a replica of the Monitor in the North Carolina Aquarium in Manio. And they actually have a live feed sometimes, like a camera underwater that'll show you all the fish swimming around and what's going on. And at one point in the 90s, they were able to bring up the turret from this ship. So there's the old cheese box itself, is what the Confederates said it looked like. Big wheel of cheese. And this was the first rotating turret that could spin 360 degrees and fire in any direction. It fired 150 pound projectile, which is the same size as the giant Parrott rifles on New Ironsides. And they were able to pull this out of the water and preserve it. So there's a lot of history here on the Outer Banks, and this is just some of the ways that the Confederate Navy, or lack of a Navy, came up with different things to disrupt the North. And it seems that the weather probably was just as disruptive as the torpedoes and the cannon fire and the Davids, but that's life at sea.